This is the CBS Sunday Night News. Bill Plante reporting. Good evening. The U.S. decision to deny a visa to Yassar Arafat for the PLO leader's speech to the UN is under attack tonight across Europe and the Middle East. UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar charges that the U.S. is violating the treaty that sets out its obligations as host to the world body. Italy, France, Sweden, and Norway have urged Washington to reconsider. Arafat met today with Jordan's King Hussein, who wants the UN General Assembly session moved to Geneva while it considers the Palestinian question. The Arab League claims that it has the votes to force such a move, which would allow Arafat to speak. Though reports suggest that the visa decision was George Shultz's alone, he has the enthusiastic support of the president, as Linda Tyra reports.
As President Reagan left California today, he stoutly defended Secretary of State Shultz's decision to deny Yassar Arafat a U.S. visa on the grounds the PLO continues to support terrorism.
I think that there's enough that he was justified in not granting the waiver. I think the other way would have sent out a wrong signal that we were patsies.
Back at the White House, Mr. Reagan faces a relatively light schedule as he prepares for a meeting on December 7th with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The White House stresses that unlike their previous meetings, this one in New York will be a conversation, a cordial discussion, not a summit. Tomorrow, the president will meet with George Bush, who will join Mr. Reagan in his talks with Mr. Gorbachev. In addition, the president will attend a dinner for one-time presidential candidate Jack Kemp, one of the most loyal soldiers of the Reagan Revolution. 8 weeks remain in Mr. Reagan's presidency, during which most of the focus will be on George Bush. While Mr. Reagan will still lead the nation, his final weeks in office will be largely as a caretaker. The time for any new initiatives is almost over. Linda Tyra, CBS News, the White House.
Well, if President Reagan is winding down, George Bush, who also returned today from the Thanksgiving holiday, is just getting started, as Ron Allen tells us in this report.
President-elect Bush returned to Washington Sunday to face a full transition agenda. Among his top priorities, the huge budget deficit. Mr. Bush has reportedly asked his top economic advisors to draft a report outlining the most effective ways to deal with the entire budget process.
President-elect Bush should come forward with his plan. And when he does, we will meet him halfway and work with him.
Tomorrow, Mr. Bush will try to make peace with Senate Minority Leader Robert Dole, his chief rival for the Republican presidential nomination, and a man whose help he will need to deal with a strongly Democratic Senate. During his Thanksgiving vacation in Kennebunkport, Mr. Bush avoided most Washington business, but the president-elect did indicate that defense would also be a priority this week. There have been strong indications that former Texas Senator John Tower will be appointed Secretary of Defense.
My advice to him is don't make a selection just because everybody's expecting it. Find the right person. It's going to be a decision you live with for a long time.
The next defense secretary will have to deal with the Pentagon procurement scandal, a task some critics feel Senator Tower is reluctant to take on because of his long association with defense contractors. And so for many observers, this appointment will spotlight how strongly committed Mr. Bush is to reform at the Pentagon. Ron Allen, CBS News, Washington.
Travelers driving home from Thanksgiving visits had a rough go of it today in western Minnesota. About 16 inches of snow, combined with 60-mile-an-hour winds, made for zero visibility and hazardous highway conditions. Police say that as many as 100 cars were involved in accidents. Later on the Sunday Night News, a look at Tuesday's big election for the job Lyndon Baines Johnson once held, the most powerful in the U.S. Senate.
Your smile.
Coffee and tea can stain your smile, like they stain your cup.
Caffrey gets out coffee and tea stains better than the leading toothpaste. Caffrey toothpaste or Minty Gel. Caffrey decaffeinates your smile.
The Soviet Parliament meets on Tuesday with Mikhail Gorbachev under growing pressure to resolve explosive disputes in 2 regions of the Soviet Union. Barry Peterson reports.
This, say some, is the sight and sound of the Soviet Union in danger of unraveling. Demonstrations in heavily Muslim Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, continued through the weekend. Troops remain on patrol here and in mostly Christian Armenia. Violent clashes between the two nationalities spilled into the streets again this past week. Even if troops keep the peace, it is an uneasy and fragile one. In Moscow today, Christian Armenians held protest demonstrations of their own at a local Armenian cemetery. And in the Baltic states, there were weekend demonstrations as well, as leaders in those Soviet republics push for independence, some demanding freedom from the Soviet Union itself. Mikhail Gorbachev signaled at least how he will handle the Baltics during a weekend meeting of the Presidium, the Executive Council of the Supreme Soviet. He rejected Estonia's move to choose what Soviet laws it will obey, but he promised unspecified changes in the proposed new constitutional amendments the Supreme Soviet will likely pass later this week. Gorbachev says the constitutional changes creating a Congress and a presidency sort of like the American system will strengthen democracy here. But critics who have studied the measure say the end result may be less democracy and a stronger Gorbachev. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Moscow.
In Vienna, the OPEC oil ministers are deadlocked tonight on an agreement that could increase the price of gasoline. Two large producers are refusing to budge from their opposite positions. Anthony Mason in London reports.
It took more than a week to craft a fragile OPEC price agreement, but in only a few minutes today, it crumbled. Just as Iran looked to be the last to agree to a floor price on crude of $18 a barrel, the Saudis suddenly said that $15 should be the minimum. The air of compromise quickly turned to chaos. With oil prices down a third from last year and in danger of collapse, OPEC ministers can't afford to go home without a deal. Many hope that by cutting output 20%, they could drive up prices and bring in sorely needed revenues. Iran and Iraq desperately need to rebuild their wounded economies after 8 years of war. But today, Iran quickly said the Saudi plan would sabotage any deal. For the oil traders who go back to their desks tomorrow, the mathematics are simple.
If OPEC comes to an agreement, prices will rise. If OPEC comes to no agreement, prices will fall substantially.
Another meeting is scheduled for tomorrow, but the Iranians say they will not compromise, and the Saudis insist they won't back down. Anthony Mason, CBS News, London.
The Reverend Pat Robertson ended a week-long visit to South Africa today. He's taking home impressions the white minority government doesn't mind at all. Martha Teichner has the story.
7 years ago, what we see here today would not have been possible. Look around you. You see black people and white people sitting together.
Evangelist Pat Robertson is confident South Africa is well on its way to eradicating apartheid. And the joyful faces that his 700 Club TV audience will see tomorrow seem to underline the point he is trying to make. Robertson's politics, staunch anti-communist conservatism, make him exactly the kind of American the South African government likes. It doesn't hurt that he has considerable clout within the Republican Party.
On Friday, I'm scheduled to meet with President-elect George Bush, at which time I plan to share briefly my findings from my visit to South Africa.
His message to Bush will be no more economic sanctions against South Africa. Exactly the same message the South African government would like to get across to every American. Martha Teichner, CBS News, Johannesburg.
You may think the political season is over, but there's a very important election this week for Senate Majority Leader. And with a Republican in the White House, the Democrat who wins Tuesday will have an enormous amount of control over just what the new administration accomplishes.
You've got to have a leader who can crack heads and build 51 votes, a majority when you need it, up against a hostile and likely to be aggressive President Bush.
And there's a real scramble for the job. Hawaii's Daniel Inouye, George Mitchell of Maine, and Bennett Johnston of Louisiana all want to succeed Robert Byrd, who is taking over the Appropriations Committee. It's the first time there's been such an openly contested election for the post in more than 50 years. Usually, the leader has been picked privately by consensus. Lyndon Johnson is probably the best known of the 15 majority leaders. He held the post with the firmest of grips during the 1950s.
It wasn't that Johnson could be the dictator of the Senate. No leader has ever been able to do that. It's 100 prima donnas in the institution. But he knew how much he could get and when he had to draw back.
Most other leaders, Mike Mansfield and Robert Byrd for the Democrats, Howard Baker and Robert Dole during the 6 years of the Republican majority, operated by consensus rather than intimidation. Handicappers say that in the current contest, only Bennett Johnston is known for his insider political skills, while Mitchell would project a thoughtful and positive image for the party and in a way represents centrist positions within the party and the Senate establishment.
Whether or not you have an individual who can get things done, who can work with the president or at times stand up to the president, who can keep his troops together, it's going to have a lot to do with the kinds of policies we'll get.
And that's the CBS Sunday Night News. I'm Bill Plante. See you on the White House beat. Good night.
I'm Harry Smith.
And I'm Kathleen Sullivan. Monday, the newest team in pro basketball, the Charlotte Hornets.
Also, Meryl Streep and Sam Neill Monday on CBS This Morning.
This is CBS.